In most lodges, it's the secretary who runs the lodge, but the Worshipful Master and the Wardens are the three principal officers and are the ones who rule the lodge. But who does the buck stop with? Who's ultimately and personally responsible for the lodge? Well, many secretaries will argue that the master has delegated this responsibility to them, and to an extent this is true. But in the secretary's investiture, it's to observe the master's will and pleasure, not act as a proxy or a pseudo-master in account of inexperience. When masters and wardens let the secretaries and past masters run the lodge, this creates a disconnect between those who are actually in power and those who assume power. In many cases, this is usually caused because there's no succession plan for the office of secretary, and it also goes with treasurer. And as for the past masters, well, we tend to stay too actively involved as we've had the experience. Now, what I've noticed across many lodges is the master and wardens are merely passengers of the lodge. They're caught up and are only consumed with what takes place between the opening and the closing of a regular meeting. They aren't aware that they're personally accountable and responsible for the lodge. And if they knew this, they'd be more active and engaged in the running of the lodge. But we as past masters are also accountable for the lodge, hence why so many of us won't let go. And we won't let the master and the wardens have the opportunity to run it as they see fit. Too many past masters strangle the lodge. They shut down initiatives and efforts by the master and the wardens on account of we've always done it this way, or many of the other usual palliatives to subdue the enthusiasm. And it's no wonder that many masters, after their time in the chair, are left wondering if it was all worth it. I know in many jurisdictions, there are two cliffs that cause membership drop-off. Once they're a Master Mason, and once they've been through the chair. And what it seems to me is a master's ability to run and rule the lodge is likely a correlation to his retention and subsequent engagement. But here's the thing, and it's what we've missed as a craft. Likely because we haven't interrogated our book of constitutions as thoroughly as we should have. So did you know that in most jurisdictions, the Worshipful Master and the Wardens are ultimately responsible for the lodge? And they're held personally accountable and responsible by the Grand Lodge. It's not the secretary, it's not the chaplain, it's not the treasurer, it's not any other officer. So here is how the master is held personally responsible and accountable by Grand Lodge. You know what gives the lodge its existence and allows the lodge to regularly hold its meetings and duly administer the rites and ceremonies of Freemasonry? Well, it's the warrant or the charter. You see, the warrant is what gives the lodge its existence. It's issued by the Grand Lodge, but who's it actually issued to? Now, before I answer that, it's important to remember the relationship between Grand Lodge is not with individual Masons. It's with lodges. Lodges have a relationship with individual Masons. And if you read our ceremonies and your book of constitution, it's the lodge who takes every action. Everything that a member of the lodge does is done by and done for or in the name of the lodge. Yes, our constitutions do have stipulations on the master and wardens, also past masters, but I'll get to that. But those are included because Grand Lodge needs to specify who at the lodge is personally responsible. You see, a lodge can't not have a master. It's the only position in the lodge where in most constitutions that no one can resign from. Yes, every other officer in the lodge can resign. And here's something interesting. Even the Grand Master can resign. But the one who can't resign in most jurisdictions is the Worshipful Master. He's practically married to the lodge, and for the master, it's a bit of a till death do us part agreement, or until he installs his successor. Now let's go back to who is the warrant issued to. Well, during the consecration ceremony, we know that it is the property of Grand Lodge, but it's entrusted to the care of the Worshipful Master, who's given the instruction to transmit it to his successor on nights of installation. Then each year, the warrant is not entrusted to the wardens, it's not entrusted to the secretary or the treasurer, but to the new master. He receives it from the immediate past master, or well, is supposed to. The newly installed Worshipful Master is entrusted with the care of the warrant. No one else is. So everything that the lodge does and could be held accountable for, well, it's all under that warrant, and he is the custodian of it. And that's why he's personally accountable. So if you read your book of constitutions, you'll find that in most cases, the recourse of action for the lodge not fulfilling its obligations, and I want to make this point very clear, it's never an individual member who doesn't fulfill the obligation of the lodge to Grand Lodge. It's always the lodge. you'll notice it's always written the lodge, because it is the lodge who has the obligations to Grand Lodge. It is the lodge that has obligations to its members. So Grand Lodge can only take action against the lodge. Now, if a Grand Lodge is going to take action against the lodge, does that mean everyone gets off scot-free? Well, if no one is accountable for the lodge, then any punishment is really superficial. And it means the individuals who carried out the actions in the name of the lodge aren't held responsible. Now, like under corporations law in most countries, which holds company directors personally responsible for the company's action, well, Grand Lodges hold principal officers, i.e. the equivalent of company directors, personally responsible. In my jurisdiction and under my constitution, if the lodge has its warrant penalised by the Grand Lodge, then the master, the wardens, and the past masters are all excluded from the privileges of Grand Lodge. And their privileges to Grand Lodge are by virtue of their lodge. They're not, as individual Masons, direct to Grand Lodge. Now, this is how the master and the wardens are held personally responsible. But where do past masters come into it? As I mentioned earlier, as past masters, we often strangle the lodge and the ideas and initiatives of the master and his wardens. And it's easy to justify this behaviour now that we understand that we're on the hook as well. But we need to realise that as a Masonic body, we're unique. And I want to go back to corporations and company law for a moment. You see, most corporations and companies, well, they've got shareholders. As Freemasons, we don't. No one has shares in our individual lodges. So when the directors of a company misbehave at the detriment of its shareholders, for companies in corporations law, this is where things like the annual general meeting, which is our Masonic equivalent, is the election of officers. The shareholders can vote out the directors and the board. And seeing as lodges don't have shareholders, we put the past masters on the hook in that purpose. They have, by virtue of having had the warrant entrusted to their keeping, if you read the Book of Constitutions, where in the absence of the master, past masters, based upon their order of precedence, are then required to step in and act as master until a successor has been duly elected and installed. But the issue of past masters strangling the lodge is because we as past masters don't understand when we're supposed to step in and when we're supposed to sit back. I'll also state that even if the secretary or treasurer is a past master, that doesn't give him the right to be master by proxy by virtue of his accountability as a past master. You see, us past masters and the members of the lodge, we elected the Worshipful Master. We elected the wardens and we elected the other officers. We need to let the master rule and govern the lodge as he sees fit. We must allow the principal officers as the rulers of the lodge to hold the other lodge officers accountable. And as I mentioned, the Constitution states that in the absence of the master, we, the past masters, are required to act. It's only in his absence, negligence, or inability to fill his duties that we elected him to do we then step in. And if it ever gets to the point where the Grand Lodge needs to penalise the lodge, then and only then is it the past master's place to become active, because they are to become active by encouraging the master and the wardens to resolve the matter. But they also need to be prepared to step up and step in and provide the support and manpower, get their hands dirty to resolve the issue. But what is this point I'm actually trying to make? Well, if you're the master or a warden, stop being a passenger. As principal officers, you are responsible and accountable for the lodge. Masters, you delegating your responsibility to your officers is not an abdication of your ultimate accountability. And past masters, let's enjoy the fruits of our labour and only be active when we have taken on an office in the lodge. And remember, we must pay due obedience to the master and the wardens. We would have wanted the past masters when we were in the chair to let us run the lodge. So let's give them the same opportunity we wish we had. And now for secretaries and treasurers. You guys are the unsung heroes of the lodge. You do a thankless job and you keep things ticking over. We couldn't live without you. We know you do this out of duty to the lodge and to the craft because you don't want to see it fail or stumble. But the truth is, because you create big shoes to fill, no one is ever going to have big enough feet to fill them.